UFC 158's conference call made a couple of things apparent to a lot of people that maybe know what's going on but don't really think about it. As I said in my Way on the Way classes for 158, that Johnny Hendricks is the people's number one welterweight contender, but Nick Diaz is the people's welterweight champion. There is no one that represents the UFC and how they conduct things more than George St-Pierre. Unlike other fighters, like Anderson Silva, who comes from a different organization, he's of a different nationality. George St-Pierre is through and through UFC. Yes, he had a career before them, but that really didn't affect him in terms of him coming to being what he is today. The conference call pretty much went like this. Nick Diaz was very upset that George St-Pierre is pampered and that he's used to being pampered. I think George St-Pierre is so much with how the UFC does its business is that he says that Nick Diaz is the number one contender in his eyes, even though Nick Diaz lost his last fight and was put on suspension. So I don't know why someone like George St-Pierre would say that unless he was pretty much told to. That's not saying that he's a bad guy or a sellout in any way. It's just saying that he's been brought up through the UFC way before the Ultimate Fighter. And it's been so strange on how the UFC's changed over the years from the original days to the Zuffa buyout to the Ultimate Fighter, and now with John Jones being the first superstar who's not an import from another big organization, we're kind of entering into this fourth era of the UFC. George St. Pierre is an excellent fighter. However, he doesn't finish fights, and that's always been a problem for a number of his fans. However, George St. Pierre is an excellent fighter who is always technically better than his opponent. So it's this catch-22 because you're in a situation where you want to protect your brand and protect your business and protect yourself at all costs. So you fight safe to get the win because UFC's diagram and this paradigm of how they incorporate people to make them number one contenders is based pretty much on your win-loss record outside of this Nick Diaz challenge that's going on that makes this thing so perplexing. At the same time, George St. Pierre doesn't take any risks because the last time he did, he got knocked out, or technically knocked out for that matter, by Matt Serra. Nick Diaz, on the other hand, has been finishing a number of his opponents, or at least in some cases making them look really, really bad. Even in losing to Carlos Condit, the way that fight kind of played out to maybe the unsuspecting eye when it comes to people who follow combat sports outside of MMA, a lot of people would feel that Nick Diaz won that fight. Personally, I don't, but I'm just saying the perception of the common viewer is that Nick Diaz won the fight and Carlos Condit was running away the whole time. That's however you feel about it, it's all said and done at this point. I think that the history books, 10 years, 12 years down the line, are not going to be so favorable to George St. Pierre and how he's been conducting himself. Unless UFC somehow makes a complete monopoly of MMA, I think that a lot of people, when they look back at George St. Pierre's career, they're going to know someone who is very well trained, very well prepared, but they're not going to feel that he is a fighter. They're going to feel that he's a wrestler who has a martial arts background. And I do have to agree with Nick Diaz in his point, which he said at the press conference about that. At some point, people want to see fights finished. So that's pretty much my take on the conference call. However, I think the thing is this when it comes to these two fighters. When it comes to George St. Pierre, he's like the movie Citizen Kane, technically perfect. When it comes to Nick Diaz, he's so professional, he's so bad he's good. He's kind of like that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Commando. All in all, I do feel that no matter what takes place at this point in time, George St. Pierre has his mark in history. But so will Nick Diaz. And I think that if more fighters, and that's why I'm very glad to see someone like Johnny Hendricks finishing fights, or people like Eric Silva, who, has a few holes in his game, but attempts to finish fights. I'm glad that we're not having fighters be lesser clones of George St. Pierre himself, and that's really the big problem with Josh Koscheck and John Fitch. There's just weaker versions of George St. Pierre. I'm glad those two guys are not so much predominant in the welterweight contender picture. But at some point, the UFC is going to have to think more like a fighting league and less like a business, because it's making some very questionable decisions. Chael Sonnen getting a title shot against John Jones, coming off a loss, even though Alexander Gustafsson was supposed to be the number one contender. Things like this, and then trying to explain it, it's getting a little bit stranger and stranger. I do like the Bellator style of during their match, everything's a tournament. However, sometimes tournaments can make certain fighters avoid each other, and then, of course, injuries may play a part into certain things. It doesn't always work out the best in the MMA format in America because you don't have more than one fight per event, unlike it is in Japan. So I just want people to really think about when they talk about George St. Pierre being the best pound for pound fighter in the world today, being up there with Anderson Silva, John Jones. How many times has John Jones finished a fight in his past 6 fights? How many times has Anderson Silva finished a fight in his past 6 fights? And then how many times has George St. Pierre finished a fight in his past 6 fights? Even though there's some very, very favorable matchups for him. I'm not the biggest fan of Nick Diaz nor his attitude. And sometimes I think it's a caricature of himself. Sometimes I think he's playing a cartoon version of himself. However, I do have to agree with him that we need more finishes in the welterweight division, and we need to have fighters be, less, I don't want to say corporate, but just so in line with the UFC at this point, because right now the welterweight division is pretty boring. So that's my rant about UFC conference call for UFC 158. Subscribe, comment, take care.